Thank you very much. We are to discuss the ecosystem of cultural policies. I would like to take this time together here to reflect on the very idea of ecosystem of cultural policies, whether anything like this exists in the first place at the local, national or European level. Are these policies there? Do they interact? Do they form a harmonious overarching system with the interplay of interests and benefits? Speaking of that, where's the beneficiary of all those systems, the society or the individual? We will take a more local approach than any other approach, indeed, because this is where beneficiaries of and consumers of culture live, but also in the context of decentralization of cultural policy as part of the Polish political transition. Responsibilities was delegated to the local authorities for decisions to be of higher quality and for provisions to be more effective. This has resulted in a chaos. There are cities in Poland where cultural institutions are owned by the local authorities, the regional authorities, or the Ministry of Culture, and they all work under the quite obsolete law on cultural activity. So there's a variety of systems. The first question is of Tomasz, as a political practitioner. Do you feel that Warsaw has an autonomy? Does the city of Warsaw really decide on the cultural policy in this city? And I mean both the officials and the council members in Warsaw at large and in the boroughs. Do you feel being in charge? How do you square this with European or national cultural policy? Tomasz Thun-Janowski. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a multifaceted question. To be very brief, I will tell you that we do not feel synergies now with policies, cultural policies that are out there. As it might be promoted or organized by the Ministry of Culture or other authorities. As far as the delegation of powers in culture to local authorities, let me ask a rhetorical question. Was it good or not? Was it a positive measure? Well, our experience are mixed, and we have mixed feelings, because on the one hand, in certain places in Poland, opportunities were created. Cities which could afford to create one united voice of the artistic or cultural community of artists and those who participate in culture, who use culture and feel it is important in such places. Social contracts or consensus has been created, it's there. And so there are policies in place, but we have a whole host of local communities, cities where nothing has happened. These local authorities.
Jednoznaczny, to chcę bardzo wyraźnie powiedzieć. Moje doświadczenie zawodowe.
My professional background is quite rich. Don't want to bore you with my professional story, but I suppose this story of mine can be relevant for this discussion. I'm a person who co-signed the Pact for Culture, signed with the Polish Prime Minister, with Edwin Bendyk, by the way. We all signed the document. We not only the signatories, but also the observers and analysts who have followed this document, we feel that this document has done its job, partly, but the mission has not been accomplished, and we have a slight sense of failure. Whilst some things did work, a lot of things didn't. Programs were initiated, but the methodologies that were based on participatory mechanisms did not play out, did not work to ensure interaction with the community. Public participation or civil society, the quality of civil society in Poland are not strong. But I also co-created the culture development program for the city of Warsaw, mentioned by Paweł Wysak and Igor. A strategic document, a local government paper, which is based on a consensus of experts, civil society, and city officials. Not perfect, clear, but a very important instrument that safeguards our values and fosters autonomy and gives us freedom to pursue our goals and objectives. As I said, the mechanisms are not perfect, but there's no other way I know of to construe a cultural policy, follow it through, support it with dialogue, and to open up to the diversity of opinions and voices. So, having said that, this document is hugely important. And if I can take longer, I would like to refer to a theme from the previous session. Someone in the room said the problem wasn't with the coexistence of elites, or the existence of two types of elites, or different types of elites, but the problem was in communication, or miscommunication, or lack of communication between the elites, lack of platforms for communication. I suppose I agree with this. And I suppose the question was very valid, and there's no simple answer to the question. I don't suppose there is a brand new elite which is, standing in the corridor waiting to enter, and we can now say, come in. No, I suppose the responsibility for making things happen is not with the local government, although I do appreciate the fact that we are praised and that we are appreciated and they are respected, and we'll do our utmost to make sure that artists are heard and their needs are mapped and their needs are satisfied or taken care of, and we are very much committed to working with a diversity of different groups, different interests, and we will make sure that all this comes together. But I suppose it's not the local government that is central. We are central. We, the community, individuals, we are as good as we are members of the society. Hoping for these external forces to be working for us is hopeless and is futile. Looking up to people who will create cultural policies somewhere out there for us is futile. We will have to create such systems, such attitudes, and participatory mechanisms. And by the way, participation is not something. It's not something you have or you have not. It's a process. It's hard work. You have to learn it. You have to develop your skills. Not all us, the officials. After 4 years working in this area, I know that the the civil society has to do its homework as well. You know, working with the social party in this tells me that we both have to learn, and we have to take the lessons learned, as bitter as they might have been on occasion. Not being critical, I'm just being positive about the reflection we need to take to address how representative all these bodies are, how consensus-driven they are, what the specific roles and responsibilities we can all have in order to be effective and efficient, and to see how we can work not just for the funds to be raised and for grants to be collected, to do certain things that might serve narrow interests, but rather how to act for a common good. So I suppose the key question is, how do we go about building the partnership and participation framework? Culture is often seen as this rich offering that fosters well-being, with initiative being on the side of artists and independent movements and informal groups. We can hardly imagine a whole mass of people who are not participating in culture. The National Library has done a study which shows that 1 out of 3 Poles read 1 book a year. I'm simplifying the findings, but just to make the point. So I suppose participation is hugely important. And the last point, and I don't want to take too long, and having experienced the last Culture Congress, and I can say that culture is present in policy. Obviously, building dialogue based on symbols and values. It's there, but being able to pursue public goals and policies requires policy and politics. So they must be there. And it's sad that we are losing our ground to politics, which is ideological and low in quality in artistic terms. So again, this is a bitter lesson of former strategies, previous strategies of building, creating culture, supporting creators and artists and understanding their needs did not do their job. Thank you very much. Let me ask Anna Méndez. Spain is more experienced in studying democracy. The death of Franco happened 10 years before 89 in Poland, and the democratization of cultural processes is a very important part of your work. So I would like to ask what it actually means, not in conceptual terms, but how do we actually understand the democratization of these processes and how relevant?
When Franco died, actually the construction of the democracy in Spain has been defined recently by this term of the culture of transition. And I think this is interesting because it puts culture in a very important role in the construction of what democracy was. How a series of consensus that were political, social, and economic consensus about how the country was going to make the transition from the dictatorship towards democracy, and also what this democracy means. Well, as you might know, May 15 in 2011 actually put in question and in crisis the term itself of democracy and reclaim it from an unexpected space and reclaim it with a radicality that was actually in the name of one of the newly created groups that called for the demonstration of the 15th May. The name was Real Democracy Now. So what started as a demonstration that was basically addressing, before the local elections and that were going to be held in 2 weeks, it was reclaiming a certain kind of basic terms of democracy also in relation with the corruption cases. And yet 2011 was already 3 years into the austerity and the so-called crisis. So this claim of what does democracy means also related to who are ruling us, basically, and in the name of what does it mean, this crisis, this austerity, this thing called austerity is actually a con, and this is not a real democracy, and actually we are kind of commodities in the hands of both bankers and politicians. So the May 15 puts the term itself of democracy in crisis. This, to make a very intense, short story, but very intense story, very, very short, led to a series of demonstrations and mobilizations across the whole country with, you know, all kind of parts of the society that kind of reached to this limit that we cannot expect this participation from the government. When Tomasz was saying, I guess it's like the we from the society must be the ones that create the participatory, the spaces. This space of participation, this space of building this new sense of democracy together was not there, and it was heavily stopped by the political situation. So from the European elections, first in 2014 and then in 2015, the local elections, there was this growing sense that we have to take this sense of democracy in our own hands, and that the way to do it was to present to the elections. And we choose to present to so there was this new party, Podemos, that presented to the European elections, won 1 million and something votes, and got 5 seats in the parliament. And very soon after that, I come from work in social movements and also on independent militant research group. And we, together with more people, decided to make this proposition to go to the local elections. So this was not only social movements, these were social movements together with the new party Podemos and together with all left party, Izquierda Unida and ECO, which is the Green Party. So it was a confluence, and confluence is a very important concept here, of this sense of change needed, this sense of democracy, this sense of basic rights and proper functioning, let's say, of the institutions had been challenged, and we want to retake democracy. So what the May 15 movement did was to put in crisis precisely this construction of democracy that was born during late 70s and 80s and 90s, and this whole culture as well, and create a new sense of democracy around these platforms that also, as Igor said, are ruling in not only Madrid, but Barcelona, Zaragoza, A Coruña, Ferrol are part of the government in Valencia and Cádiz and many other places, actually also small places down to, I don't know, a few thousand villages, right, with all these kind of platforms. Our sense of what a democratic management of the institutions mean is very much, we define it in the cultural department through 3 axes, 3 main lines. One was to have access to the resources, to understand culture as a commons. And if you understand culture as a commons, you have to first analyze what are the resources that these commons are based on, what are the kind of communities that can manage it, and what is the way they are managed, like the basic three elements of the commons. The second one was the openness of the institutional structure, not only in terms of transparency, also in terms of participation of society. And so let me remember, acceso, apertura. And then the other one was the support to the cultural production. And then we understood culture as a very, very wide frame that went from, whatever artistic, sanctioned, maybe kidnapped in some bank vaults were there, to what people were doing, in the street. On that sense, I have to say that we have got some interest in also new senses and new common senses that have gone through to the society that are not like kind of these radical measures or coming from a radical group. One of them, which is very interesting, is the issue of decentralization. This was Spain in general, because also of the Franco history, but Madrid as well. I have to point out here that Madrid was ruled by the Conservative Party for 25 years before we arrived in the government, and the last 10 years under a very neoliberal structure implemented by the previous mayor. And that we actually are in the government with the votes and the support of the Socialist Party. So the Socialist Party is not in the government, but supports the action and has actually helped to the election of the mayor. So anyway, so this decentralization of our own programs have been very strong. We have also been able to implement new spaces for participation, for thinking together. But nevertheless, there is an inherent resistance of the institutions to change that have both good and bad aspects. And I here also want to clarify that when we speak of institutions, we usually speak of the public institutions of the nation state. And we have to understand them in this long stream. First, because the nation state is a very specific construction that is actually in crisis. And this crisis affects to their own institutions. And secondly, because we are talking about certain kind of public institutions. The nation state have institutions that operate over reality that are not public. There are public institutions that are not state-based. And there are other kinds of institutions. There are also private institutions. I'm saying this because I think that there is an aspect of institutions that is very interesting and that we have to look at. And that if we, in this discussion of how to deal with the issue of culture, we have to acknowledge the limits, but also the potentials of having structures that survive over time, that are able to give rules to themselves, that are able to produce and reproduce through time. And in that aspect, for example, and regarding also like the previous table, what at least I found out in the work of inside the city council and the kind of public policies that we deliver from that is that at the end of the day, maybe programming is not the key factor of our public policies. I don't know if Tomasz will agree with me. It's, okay, programs are important and they create an imaginary and they create a storytelling. And, but what the public institution can do, the public government with the city council can do is much broader, and it has a way of also we identify another kind of resources. So we have the resources of the money. This is basic. We have just launched is the first big package of public subsidy and grants in the city of Madrid, up to 8 million euros going in a public call to cultural producers. This is fine. Then we also identified the spaces in themselves, and where there is a series of also decrees and policies opening up the space and the access to spaces and cultural spaces to everybody. But there is also the more kind of deep structural policies, like how do you make the contrast? How do you recognize the agents? How is the construction of the terms and the concepts that the institution actually works with constitutes, and this is information engineering concept, is the ontology, the information ontology of the institution, how the institution names, recognize, asks all the bylaws and the normatives and the decrees that the institution actually use as tools to operate over the reality. This is the real structural change of the public policy. And this is the part that is most important to change. On the other hand, it is true that going also back a little bit to your first question about how is the ecology of the different institutions. I was very much amazed by, I don't know if you're familiar with the Horizon 2020 research lines of the European Union. If you take challenge 6, the social challenge, and then the first topic of this challenge 6, and I'm going to read it to you, says, discourses on the legitimacy of the UA, and especially its democratic deficit, has been a perennial issue for many years, but have become significantly more urgent and present in times of crisis and austerity. At both ends of the political spectrum, claims about the illegitimacy of current UN governance and regulation have found broader resonance expressed both in public manifestations of discontent combined with claims for alternative forms of legitimacy and in electoral successes of radical right and radical left. I don't know if this actually applied to us. Parties across Europe, in this context, question of justice, fairness, and European solidarity have equally been raised. The concept of justice is inherently connected with the rule of law and entails a right to justification. Fundamental rights are also key in this regard. The European Stability Mechanism and the Fiscal Compact have been regarded by some as emblematic challenges not only to the rule of law, but also to democratic governance. What is more, specifically in the light of some recent election results in EU member states, it seems as if not only the legitimacy of certain policies and institutions have been questioned, but also fundamental issues concerning the locus and exercise of popular sovereignty have been questioned, have been placed on the agenda. This specific challenge, so basically, this is a European title called Democracy and the Rule of Law that is placed on the culture strategic line, and that somehow tries to deal from the culture with this problem of what are we going to do with this society that feels not, anymore in relation, and that have lost all kind of the sense of sovereignty in their own institutions, and actually recognize that the fiscal compact and the UA austerity measures are a big part of this sense. So I think that following recall of the development of the Pogon and Right to the City, and then now this new platform, but also our own experience, I would say that on one hand there is a limitation of what the institutions can do in terms of their own specific structural content and dynamics, but on the other hand, I think that we have to be aware that culture, at least in Spain, is a key aspect of a broader, we call it, we are in the middle of a cultural war. We in Madrid for now 1.5 years, we we were in a very fierce, contested cultural war that I cannot say that we have won. We have made, some kind of strategic positions, but the war is still going on very much. So I think that the questions, again, for the public policies is to which kind of politics you ascribe. And one of these lines of the battle is precisely, at least in Madrid, one of the lines of the battle is precisely there is a technical, managerial governance that is apolitical and that has nothing to do with the ideology of the social movements when the battle comes on us, that I totally not ascribe to that. And I think is a serious problem. And then there is, on the issues that have been brought here before, is the question of the participation as a way of opening up these democratic structures. But there we have to be aware that the institution can put, the public institution of the city government can put in place certain kind of devices and structures, but it is relying on the society and the capacity of society of organizing and articulate with these devices that actually the change is going to be able to operate on a wide level. So. I don't know. I'm afraid it's really like the context is complex, and also what happens in Spain the last year is that political context more or less changes every 6 months, which makes things very complicated to explain. But it has actually allowed us a lot of resilience on the other hand, and I'm open to questions later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now a question to you, Edwin, because since we're talking about the European Union, you've had a look at Wrocław, the European Culture Capital. The Culture Capital program is a flagship cultural program alongside Creative Europe. It's one of the most important. So what are your thoughts looking at what happened in Wrocław? Did you see a synergy between the local politics and EU policy? Of course, with the caveat that the European Culture Capital is required to cooperate with the local government. And if you saw any restrictions, limitations, did these result from institutional or mental factors? It's true that the program was interesting, and for similar reasons to the ones that Anna mentioned just now, because preparation of the program, starting from the choice of Wrocław as European Culture Capital, it was between 2012 and 2016, so that 4-year period was a time of very intense, not just in Poland, but also in the European Union, of debates and political processes that directly affected the preparations at local level. This meant that despite there being a concept, a program, they needed to redefine the objectives and the program in light of changing political demand on the part of Wrocław residents. 2012 was the peak moment, symbolized by the Euro 2012 football championship. Wrocław was one of the host cities, and that's when they began working on the European Culture Capital as a follow-up, the idea being that 2016 would be a post-crisis year, and the European Culture Capital would be a fiesta celebrating the end of the crisis, a crisis that affected Poland, that didn't affect Poland severely, but this would only serve to confirm that Poland had weathered the storm and had come out successful. But the model didn't work. There was the peak in 2012, but then there came the city activists, the local government, the by-elections in 2014 were another opportunity for new agents, actors to appear in the city, which had a direct impact. And it was really fascinating to watch. It also meant that the implementation of the program was far from what had originally been intended. The need to redefine was continuous, but there was continuous need to redefine and redesign. But there were various levels and regimes of management. The European Culture Capital as a project, the process was preceded by communication with the EU agencies that came and negotiated the program premises, the regulations. It was a very intense process. But then there was the implementation, where the Polish state was expected to play a very serious role. This was prior to the 2015 elections, and it turned out that the multi-annual government program, which was to help finance the program, because originally it was 200 million zlotys, that's what Wrocław was applying for, and that was cut to over just about 135 million zlotys. That's 35 million euros. But the decision was taken a month before the 2015 election, 6 months before the actual program was to begin, which meant that it was impossible to prepare many items that were that depended on the multi-annual program. So that's the state of relations between the local government and the central government prior to the 2015 election. And what was also significant, and that was also relevant. I know in terms of my program was pegged to the multi-annual program, and we could only begin in 2016. We could only begin signing contracts in 2016. So much for background. And now, from a less governance but more culture promoting perspective, the things that happened in the city. Okay, when you have this inflow of money that exceeds the city's annual culture budget, how it can stir things up, it produces opportunities, it brings a lot of opportunities, but with this amount of resources, it's very difficult to put it to use when you have an insufficient ecosystem, cultural ecosystem in the city, if it's not mature enough in terms of connections between the various actors. And when managing culture, when outside of Warsaw, where for structural reasons the situation is entirely different, no single actor dominates here, and even public funds in Warsaw. There's over 800 million. And there are 4 decision makers in culture, as in the part and the tranche that concerns culture. Tomasz Thun-Janowski's office is responsible for a quarter of these funds. Then you have the various boroughs and districts and central government agencies. This is heterogeneous, but in Wrocław, which is also a large city, but in Wrocław there is a monopoly, largely in managing public funds. The monopoly is exercised by the city authorities, which leads to the creation of a corporate culture or a management culture in culture. And when there's a competing center with a huge budget, the bureau managing the ECC program, you get inevitable tension, and there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance. Which money one should apply for, because there's another pool of resources that you can apply for, but there's tension between the agencies. And when it turns out that the milieu is not integrated, and the additional injection of funds leads to further disintegration, and this leads to effects that aren't exactly what one would expect of a European culture capital, because the idea is to reinforce the metropolitan position of the city, but where did Wrocław end up? I mean, apart from a series of events, but structurally, it was a process of demetropolization. If we look at Teatr Polski, as you all know, although that's not the fault of the city, because that's an institution run by the so-called Marshal's Office, which is the regional executive, and the Marshal's Office, the regional executive, together with Teatr, actually managed to suppress or managed to generally obliterate, destroy essentially a theater, and Muzeum Współczesne, the contemporary art museum, which was a city-run institution after its director, Dorota Munkiewicz, and that had the potential of becoming a national institution, also lost prestige and status. And this is a process.
So this process has not yet been completed, and we do not know what will happen. And I suppose this year we will learn more as we look back at the European culture capital. But this also a very volatile political context in Wrocław locally. Mayor Dudkiewicz will not stand for re-election. So the winner of the local elections will decide and we'll see how it goes. So things went different. Things went differently than expected. Doesn't mean wrong, but we don't really have the certainty of how it'll all end. So what is the key recommendation or lesson learned, perhaps, when you compare Wrocław and Warsaw? And we did a comparative study like this, and you were involved in a study that looked at the cultural potential of Wrocław prior to what we did for Warsaw. And we both applied the ecosystem approach, and it proved effective. In Warsaw, the scale and the heterogeneous nature of management means that we have a number of stakeholders, a number of actors that have to interplay, that have to interact. There are private and public institutions. There's a strong cultural business sphere, and there are checks and balances in place. Even if there are conflicts, there is a system that has the checks and balances, and it allows for strategies to be pursued, and they are artistic, business strategies, or mixed. All this is absent in Wrocław. There are single actors, not networked, not woven, if you like, in the city fabric. So I suppose the culture policy, the local culture policy, should strive for more complexity and heterogeneity of management. For example, not only grants, public grants should be given on a competitive basis, but also we should have a larger number of grant makers, public grant makers. And it's a political decision. You may decide upon this. It worked so well with the micro grants in Wrocław during the culture capital. Can you do that? Of course you can. It's doable. The existing institutional framework is such that you can actually demonopolize it, you can devolve it, and And you may actually speed up the process of creating an ecosystem that I'm talking about. If the decision about decentralization is not made, it'll be counterproductive. Wrocław will no longer pull resources and pull artists and pull the spirit of art and culture, but will rather be an exporter. And we have seen the exodus of artists from Wrocław to Warsaw in recent time. So the question is now, will the political contestants and the local political protests look at culture? Will they acknowledge the importance of culture? And will they have a progressive vision for a culture policy, or will they be focused on status quo and fossilized systems? So I suppose the million, if the latter happens, the millions invested during the culture capital will be lost. John Holden's concept of culture is such that the ecosystem is as strong as the diversity of players and the interdependencies between them. So the more sources of funding, the more the bigger the network of interactions and interdependencies at the public level and in the very individual level in terms of what we read and what hobbies we have. It all is interdependent, and the power of interdependency is really the defining factor for the power of the ecosystem. So let me ask Alicja Borkowska, who has experienced herself the micro ecosystem, and she has experienced the fluctuations and the changes that have been part and parcel of the cultural policy landscape. The ecosystem that you are part of, does it, the diversity of sources of funding, not just funding, but also human resources and creative resources, and the customers. Does it make you feel safe? Are you certain that if something is changed in the system, is disrupted in the system, the EU changes its policy or the government of Poland changes its policy, do you feel that the system is diverse enough and balanced enough for you to continue to operate smoothly? I like the idea of micro participant of a micro ecosystem, and I feel being a micro participant. I feel a micro participant myself. In fact, that reflects well my role. Well, do I feel safe? In response to this question, I suppose I should say that while we are micro participants, micro players, we are very much dependent on the political developments. The WolnoSłowa Strefa WolnoSłowa, the free word zone, we started 5 years ago in a totally different political atmosphere, I might say, with a different atmosphere around refugees, because our foundation is very much active in culture and arts and theatre, but we work with refugees, migrants, and we very much focus on group activities of Poles and migrants alike. And I suppose we didn't realize several years ago how political our work was. It all started on as a grassroots movement with a lot of enthusiasm. Here we are meeting together, doing a great job, and money will be found for that, won't it? And it'll be great. And we have always hoped for some sort of funding, and ultimately we have received funding from the EU, and that was the Europe for Citizens program that we used, and we found that priorities there, collaboration and intra-group collaboration, artistic groups with different audiences, and also networking. By the way, we are a small organization. We have, ever since we started, felt a need to create a community, not to be alone. So we were looking for partners, and we were looking for grassroots NGOs to partner with. Over time, we turned our attention to the European Union for funding, and we started working together with institutions. And we had a number of projects that helped us integrate with, or do integrated things with institutions. We created networks and partnerships, and this is how we landed in this relationship with the theatre here. But having said that, we started out in a completely different political atmosphere. And I suppose we have seen a change at the micro level. There's a different perception of what we do now as opposed to 5 years ago. 5 years ago, people were interested in, they were ready to participate, keen on coming to shows with refugees and migrants. Who are they? They were, people were, curious and really keen to learn more. Now, well, we have been separated by the other side. Now, there is another side in the first place. We have now turned into a very leftist organization now. I mean, this is how we have been defined recently. And this has an impact on our day-to-day operations, the general political atmosphere, the developments of 2015, the entry into force of the right-wing government, and the new approach to migrants and especially refugees. This has had an impact, and the political perception of refugees, even though very strong, very, very hostile, even though not supported by physical exposure to refugees in this country. We have felt it. We have felt it financially. We have a sense of less security. The Ministry of Culture and the funding is no longer available, nor is it safe for anyone to count on the Norwegian grants under the European Economic Area financial mechanism. So we feel more vulnerable. We rely more on local resources. We are part of a regional process and local process in Warsaw. And we certainly are working with other stakeholders, other players. Again, we are very much oriented to networking. So this is really a repetition or a replica of the list of priorities set out by the EU years ago, with a view to culture being internally integrated, but also outward oriented, to create links and to be part and parcel of a more diverse system. And I suppose it's great that we see those types of priorities at the local level, ignoring the national level for a minute or so. So it's important that we embrace collaboration, and we have much more. We have a lot to improve in this area as a society. We're not very good at listening to one another and working together. So there's an area of improvement here. And diversity, openness. Revitalize the regeneration project is very much a good example of being open to ideas and diversity, merging the different worlds, understanding them. Now we have the EU Creative Europe program, or a refugee reintegration program launched last year. Two things that certainly contribute to stronger democracy, the topic that we raised earlier. So democracy is being approached through culture. And culture may now be viewed as a building block of a system that will embrace refugees and migrants and provide support. And obviously this requires concerted action of a number of stakeholders, institutions and charities to create a safe framework, and an open framework for that matter, so that we're not closed in ghettos. Political ghettos being, on the barricades against detrimental or hostile political movements, and closed to diversity. So let's have a discussion, Q&A now. So we welcome questions and comments.
I didn't introduce myself before. Stach Glombiński is my name. A number of times you said that we need dialogue, that conversation is needed. The lady who spoke just now also said something to that effect, and Mr. Janowski from the Warsaw city authorities also said something to that effect. Everybody seems to be thrilled, happy, but there's a dissonance I see here. I apologize, but I'll have to raise an unpleasant issue. This conference is organized by Political Critique. I hope there is somebody from Political Critique in the room, because I don't like speaking in the absence of the person I want to address. If when talking about dialogue, we can't neglect, we must bear in mind that in political critique, the question of dialogue is hopeless. There's an utter lack of interest in what readers, how readers respond to the content, to what they say. In magazines and publications, there are letters from readers, and I see a lack of interest here in the response to what is written, what is published. The publications of political critique is a collection of monologues, not to say sermons. Could we get back to the topic, the ecosystem of cultural policies, and not political critique? I'm sure we'll find. So how can we talk about the need for dialogue when we have in the room a representative of someone who does not want to enter into a dialogue, and this isn't being addressed? Let's imagine a meeting, a gathering of people against theft or burglary, and you have fine speeches, but there are a couple of thieves in the room. Everybody knows they steal, and they'll just go their own ways and say that we did our bit to clamp down on theft with our speeches, with our fine speeches. And the thieves in the room are applauding and are delighted. So you can't be this way.
Thank you very much. I don't want to trivialize or play down what you said, but let me just say that political critique is the main organizer of this conference. Myself and a colleague of mine. And it appears that the very fact that we are creating a platform for discussion for many people and from many countries, and mind you, we could just organize a conference with ourselves and on the panels and to have a series of monologues and soliloquies. Your strong criticism may not be too fair, I suppose. I don't want to argue with you at this very moment on that topic, but I will be more than happy to revisit this topic with you during the break, and we can discuss this further and more specifically. If you have any issues, specific recommendations, I'll be more than happy to discuss it with you. Patrycja Frąckiewicz. Some of you mentioned the interlinkages between civil society and a society which has much appetite and informed appetite for culture, for that matter. And we are focusing on metropolitan areas where access to culture is strong and where opportunities for grassroots movements are great, and where central government can have a weaker power to intervene as opposed to smaller communities, rural communities. Now, all this leads me to a question, because I see that most of the discussion actually focused on metropolitan areas with easy access to culture, even to those who are not too keenly interested. Let's take a look at rural communities in contrast, where access to culture is none. And there are geographic obstacles. You know, people in small communities live hundreds of miles from major cities where culture can be consumed, and there are no local provisions. there's no local offering. So how do you see the possibilities to influence culture in such communities? You mentioned the readership survey, and by the way, the National Library has made another study that shows that 1 in 5 households in Poland has books. So I suppose we should take a walk through rural communities, and going from household to household, we could see which homes have books. Thank you very much. I've been slightly disciplined by the organizers, so let's have another question, and then we'll ask for answers. A short comment: culture should perhaps be treated as social policy. And social policy has a budget, has a 50% share of the local budgets, and in Finland they have calculated that the cost of a person who is not engaging in culture is 1 million euros. Because they are not proactive, they may be involved in criminal, etc., activity, etc., etc. And the Finns have calculated that the best method to counteract marginalization are theatres. Independent theatres and theatre groups and socially vulnerable areas and disadvantaged communities. So it is our area of omission that we have not done anything to remediate the situation. So local cultural clubs should be part of the social policy to curb unemployment. Rehearsal rooms or rehearsal houses have been created in Sweden, in Swedish rural communities, for people to release their energy there rather than in the streets. Could we have answers? I'll be more than happy to take these questions. Thank you for them, by the way. Very important questions. The first question about the peripheries as opposed to the centre or centres. Obviously, this is not an area where we have a mandate or we have control, but we do acknowledge the importance of the point. And by the way, we had a fascinating debate in the Congress of Culture about the mutual expectations of the centre and the peripheries, and how can both learn from one another, and how cultural policies should be construed to make sure that culture reaches out to those who are socially vulnerable or excluded. And we know that culture has class characteristics, and there are class aspects of access to culture, place of residence, income level, geographic proximity. Obviously, these are serious issues. You can't address it with a single program. It's a major social transition that takes years. And I suppose devolution and decentralization will play an important role. The second question about culture as part of social policy. A very interesting question, by the way. Let me just say that in Warsaw we have tried several such measures. Cultural education program, for example. this document is shared by several units in the local authority. It's being co-created by not only officials but also people who work in schools. The program to regenerate the district of Praga, another good example, where we moved away from silos, government silos. And by the way, Professor Hausner has written about it quite often. He wrote about the management paradigm which turns its back on the contemporary society. So moving away from silos, creating space for charities, for local non-governmental organizations that share the responsibility for culture with culture units and other authorities. We are also rewriting or completing the 2030 development strategy for Warsaw. The responsible community is the motto of this document, of this strategy, which is being written in a participatory manner, which has its cons, true, but it is important that administration will have to consult the public and will have to listen to the voice of the public much more extensively. This is going to create a new paradigm for the city administration. And thanks to Professor Hausner, we have started a campaign to rewrite the missions of local theatres so that the social goals and objectives are added to the missions, so that theatres can now reflect on how they're going to function in the society and what their social role might be, with a view to putting it in the missions. And I suppose these issues, these movements, if you like, are very important. And last but not least, exclusion. This autumn, we will have a study on those who do not participate in culture, who are not culture users. There's been some research about that, but we feel there's still much to be done to understand why there are so many people in Warsaw who have not been part of the cultural process. Even though the cultural provisions are so rich, we need to understand what happened, why these people are not in. Is there anything we could do to change this situation?
I'll begin by commenting on what you said. These recommendations are contained in the program for the development of creative potential in the culture development program. Cultural policy must cease being run by the ministry, but needs to be part, or the culture department, but needs to be part of the multi-sectoral city development policy. And we know from the experience of Medellin in Colombia or Brazil's Portos de Cultura, we know that effective social intervention requires cultural intervention, including the symbolic appreciation, recognition of the stakeholders, and the activity of cultural policy vis-a-vis things that we're seeing in Warsaw, namely interest among young people in careers in culture, which they cannot pursue in the traditional culture sector. There's not enough jobs, not enough money to finance the several thousand new artists graduating from art schools, if not over 10,000. And we need to rethink this. We need to expand the scope, the pool of the authority to conduct policy, and the resources to be distributed among stakeholders and artists who benefit from social intervention. So this is something that we're aware of, but it's difficult to translate that into management practice for a large agglomeration like Warsaw. But there's no turning back, and that's certain. It all depends on how soon we learn to apply this. Now, something that we call the province, arbitrarily, because this doesn't just concern the villages or the countryside. There's an interesting category of social, cultural exclusion of the middle class in the suburbs, who can't enjoy culture in the city centers because they have no way of commuting, or the children of these middle class suburbanites can't go see a show, a theater play, for instance, in the evening. So but they are a group of people who are excluded from culture in Warsaw, despite they being well-to-do. When we mapped the culture of Praga, take the district of the neighborhood of Gottsław, and the cultural offering there, so you can have provincial areas also in metropolitan areas, in metropolitan city, and not just in the provinces. The Cultural Congress showed an interesting potential. Professor Hausner mentioned this, saying that we have new phenomena. There's a lot of bad things happening. Cultural management at municipal levels is often pathological indeed, but there are initiatives, often independent, often in sync or not in sync with municipal policy, that show that there is an outburst of new energy, new subjectivity, empowerment, such as the Tolkowisko in Gorajec or the Szczebrzeszyn, the capital of the Polish language. These are small towns. Or Węgajty, a small village in northeast Poland, and annually they organize events and festivals, and they are sustainable. And this shows that there is potential for culture to thrive and flourish, and not just as regards access to what's being produced in the larger centers, but also active participation in culture. The problem is, at the moment, has to do with it's creation of an archipelago. And the creation of political ability to counteract because a small organization in a small town like Cieszyn on the southern border is helpless on its own in the face of a village head, a mayor, or but if they were backed by other similar organizations, it's not a question of pressuring the authorities, but just showing the benefits that can stem from cooperation, that cooperation can give. That would be a game changer. And this is it's the legacy, it's the unfinished legacy of the Congress. We spoke about the Confederation of Cultural Provinces. We still haven't made it to that meeting in Krasnogruda, but before November, before the conference that Paweł Łysak announced, hopefully we will have managed to get something done. Would you like to comment?
I think there is a danger of assuming there is one culture, and I think there is also the striving of the rural areas to create their own culture, and there is a couple of interesting examples in Spain. I can just give you the reference of how you create your own networks, and it's not that you have to bring culture to them as kind of Fitzcarraldo kind of thing of bringing the opera up the Amazon. No? I think there are two things that somehow resonates with important question. One is this thing of, I totally agree with the issue of the social and the cultural, but I think that we should be aware of the dangers of trying to be social engineers through another means. I was for a long time working on cultural production related with interventions in public space with architects, and we used to have this question of, can design, or in this case, can culture solve problems, social problems, and Matthias Rix from Raumlabor used to say, we are not here to solve problems, we are here to create problems, which means we are here to actually politicize and make things more complex, and we are, I think, all aware how while solving some problems, then you create another problem. So I think it's this thing of social engineering, we should take it a little bit with caution. And the other thing that resonates was the first intervention. I was telling Catherine and Philip this morning how one of the actually consequences of the construction of this culture of transition in Spain, and that has been a part of the cultural wars, is that the construction of this culture comes with the construction of an industry, and what comes with construction of a certain sector that feels threatened by the policies that we were implemented from the city hall for the kind of different programs and different agents that in a field of scarce resources, we were putting into discussion who has, access to financial and also symbolic capital. And one of the complaints that as part of this cultural war was played on the table and was blamed on us that come from the social movements and much more from the subculture than from the high culture or the e-culture, is that we were not talking with them. And we say, yes, we are talking with them, we just don't agree. So this is also fair enough, that you don't have to always agree with the dialogue. So also as a note.
Dziękuję bardzo. Szanowni Państwo, dziękuję moim panelistom, dziękuję Państwu za uwagę.